Hello. As Nancy said, I'm Deborah Capel, and on behalf of the board of the Princeton Adult School, I'd like to welcome you to our first lecture in the series, Cities and Civilizations. I'm happy to be here to introduce Molly Green, who's a professor in Princeton University's History Department, and she's also in its program in Hellenic Studies, and she's also the Director of Graduate Studies for the History Department. Her topic tonight will be Istanbul, the Imperial City. Professor Green earned her BA in political science at Tufts University, after which she spent several years in Greece. Then she came to Princeton, where she got her PhD in the Department of Near Eastern Studies in Ottoman history. She studies the history of the Mediterranean basin, the Ottoman Empire, and the Greek world. In particular, the social and economic history of the Ottoman Empire, the experience of Greeks under Ottoman rule, Mediterranean piracy, and the institution of the market. And here's something that I found extremely impressive and important. Professor Green can do her research in Greek, Italian, French, Ottoman Turkish, and Turkish. That's pretty great. At Princeton, Professor Green has taught courses on Mediterranean history, 16th century to 20th century, early modern commerce in the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, national identity in the Balkans, Greeks and Jews in the late Ottoman Empire, and the history of Jerusalem. In her first book, which is called A Shared World, Christians and Muslims in the Early Modern Mediterranean, she examined the transition from Venetian to Ottoman rule on the island of Crete, which the Ottomans conquered in 1669. For her next book, Professor Green is working on a study of the relationship between Greek commerce and Catholic piracy in the 17th century Mediterranean. At the heart of the book is a series of court cases from the island of Malta, where Greek plaintiffs attempted to retrieve merchandise that had been taken from them in raids by the Knights of St. John. If you'd like to read more about Professor Green's work, there's a very interesting interview posted on the History Department's webpage at Princeton EDU. And in the meantime, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Molly Green.
Thank you for coming out on such a cold night. It's most of my classes are small. This is quite overwhelming, actually. The picture that you have here is the waterway that you're looking at, facing south towards the Mediterranean, is the Bosphorus, which one poet of Istanbul called a diamond between two emeralds. Okay? And on the left side is Asia, and on the right side is Europe. You get a better sense of it here. Okay. So if you're standing at the place that's called Karakoy or Galata, looking south, that was what you were seeing, the Bosphorus. Okay, and this gives you a sense of where Istanbul is in relationship to Turkey in general, right on the border between Europe and Asia. And this is, its location is certainly one of the three aspects of the city that I think have guaranteed and will continue to guarantee its fame. The first point of its fame is the natural beauty of the city. I certainly haven't been to every city in the world, but I've been to a lot, and in my view, it's the most beautiful city I've ever seen. Although you will see from the quotes I give at the end of the lecture, some people are quite melancholy about Istanbul today. But speaking as a foreigner, I certainly think it's a tremendously beautiful city where you can sit on either side all day and just watch the boats go up and down the Bosphorus. Secondly, it has a spectacular position on the narrow channel, the Bosphorus, which connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Okay, and here I'll show you this map again. Okay. So going up north, you'll just about an hour's sort of leisurely boat ride out of Istanbul going north up the Bosphorus. You'll be in the Black Sea. And I haven't done it down to the Mediterranean, but it's not too far down to the Mediterranean. Most important pre-modern cities, from London to Paris to Rome, were located on or near a waterway, because transportation by water was so much cheaper, because it was so much easier than transportation over land. Okay? Istanbul had this and more. It controlled access from the north to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. And whoever controlled Istanbul was also able to control the Black Sea. So it's not just any waterway, but it's a waterway between the Eurasian landmass and down to the Mediterranean. Secondly, another sort of part of its spectacular position is what you see there is the Golden Horn. Okay? And this is a spectacular natural harbor. It's 1 kilometer wide and 6 kilometers long. One wrote, its site seems to have been expressly created to receive the wealth of the four corners of the earth. Thirdly, Istanbul, first Constantinople, actually even before that Byzance, has been throughout most of its history an imperial city. It was capital first of the Byzantine Empire, and then capital, I'm showing you here the outlines of the Ottoman Empire. Although the Byzantine and the Ottoman Empire occupy essentially the same space. Okay, although the Byzantines never managed to get up into Hungary, that blue line you see up there is the Danube, and the Ottomans for about 100 years were beyond that. I'm sure you've heard of the Turks knocking at the gates of Vienna, so they came close to Vienna. But Constantinople was first the capital of the Byzantine Empire from early in the 4th century until 1453, and then capital of the Ottoman Empire from 1453 until 1923. So its current sort of reincarnation as just a city in a way, it's not even the capital city of Turkey, is unusual. For most of its history, it's been the capital of very formidable and far-flung empires. It's no longer the capital because the founder of the new Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, deliberately wanted to leave it behind in what he considered a corrupt and used up, decaying imperial legacy for the city of Ankara deep inside Anatolia. Let me show you where that is. Yeah, there's the capital, okay? Which was considered to be a purer, more Turkish city than the multinational Ottoman capital. He wanted a new city for a new kind of country. But Ankara has never had the charms of Istanbul. A story is told, perhaps apocryphal, but telling nevertheless, that one of the deputies to the new Turkish parliament, because of course all the government buildings were moved to Ankara, a deputy from Istanbul who was obliged now to live in Ankara was asked what was the best thing about the new city, about Ankara, and he said, the road back to Istanbul. And I think most people who have been to Ankara feel that way as they're going back to Istanbul. There's a story that's told about the original founding of the city in 660 BC. The founder's name was Bizas, hence the term Byzantine Empire, which, however, was never a term that the Byzantines used themselves. They called themselves New Rome. Before the founder of the city, this Bizas, before going out to found this new city, as was common, he asked the oracle at Delphi where he should build it. And the oracle answered famously opposite the city of the blind. Wait a minute, sorry. So he traveled and traveled, and what he came to was the city of Halcedon, okay, where you see Üsküdar today. That's where a settlement was on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. And he looked at this settlement and saw that they had turned their back on not only the European side, which is higher up, it's on a bluff, but were not taking advantage of the spectacular harbor. Therefore, they were blind, and he built his city across from the city of the blind. Now, this city, known in antiquity as Byzantium, survived as a relatively unimportant settlement, and it really entered history in the 4th century AD when Constantine, the Roman emperor, decided to move the capital from Rome to some point further east. And this is Constantinople's real birth. He did this because by this time all the wealth and the population of the empire was in the east, and the declining city of Rome no longer seemed fit for an emperor and for the capital of the Roman Empire. He quickly recognized all the advantages of the city of Byzantium, and he refounded the city, which was a common practice in antiquity, and he named it after himself, Constantinople, founded in 324. This magnificent harbor easily defended. The only defensive weakness of the city is that it's very easily approachable from land, from the west. It's completely flat. So in the 5th century, Emperor Theodosius built the Theodosian walls, as they are known, which are still standing. You can see in some places in better shape than others. Okay? But these walls, like many things about Constantinople, were considered one of the marvels of the ancient world. He called it Constantinople. He also called it New Rome, okay? Which is why the Greeks, for centuries, and to a certain extent even today, it depends on the context, called themselves Romans, Romni, okay? Which is something Westerners always thought was very odd, because in the Western view, the Roman Empire ended when Rome ended. But this is not how people viewed it in what became the new Roman Empire and what became the Greek Orthodox East. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, Constantine is famous for many things. Founding Constantinople is just one of them. He was also the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. But it is not the case, although it's sometimes presented this way, that Constantine converted to Christianity and built this city and made it the center of the Christian world. In fact, his conversion to Christianity was a deathbed conversion. And the way he viewed Christianity was that he saw Jesus and the cross as kind of a cult, okay? Like many cults. And he chose to associate himself with Jesus and the cross, but he was not inclined, okay, later emperors would be, but he wasn't inclined to shut down other cults. Okay, this fluidity, the many gods and cults of pagan Rome continued in Constantinople. Like most of his predecessors, Constantine sought divine support for his rule, and ultimately came to base his power on this special connection with the Christian God. In fact, the early fathers of the church worried about how they were going to separate out Christianity from all these other cults. Okay? In a way, they were happy that he converted, but they didn't want people to equate Jesus and the cross with the pagan cults. So, given that this was his attitude, he built Constantinople as a late antique city. Okay? He didn't disturb the pagan temples on the Acropolis, which is this area here where it says Seraglio Point. Okay, that's the highest point. Now the palace of the sultans are there, but under the Greeks it was an Acropolis, as you would see in Athens or any other late antique city or a city of antiquity. He didn't disturb the pagan temples. He probably built, it's not clear, just 3 churches. Okay? One of the churches he built, or we think that he built, is still extant, St. Irene. It burned down. It was built in the 4th century. We think that the Second Council of the Christian Church in 381 was held in this church. It burned down in the 6th century. Istanbul has always suffered from fires, and most of the city, until recently, was built of wood because wood was so abundant in the lands of the Byzantines and later on with the Ottomans. So the city has suffered a lot from fires, but it was rebuilt anyway, and then enlarged over the centuries. So this church is still extant, as are a number of Byzantine churches, although obviously only a small portion of the original amount. So this is a map of the city under the Byzantines, and you can see the straight roads, okay, which were very typical of Roman cities. Constantinople was built with all the normal features of late antique cities. There was the straight avenue bordered by colonnades, the messe called, and that street still exists. It's Divanyolu today in Istanbul. At intervals along this grand avenue, you can see there were squares or forums, and the heart of the city was Constantine's Forum. And in fact, we still have a column. Okay? This is what is left of Constantine's Forum. Originally, there were many columns, and the whole structure was made of porphyry, and it supported a statue of the emperor. Nearly every emperor in the late antique period commemorated his reign by erecting monuments, and there were all sorts of statues of emperors and pagan gods in the city. Okay? And there was the Roman Senate building as well. But at the same time, and this is a view, if you're looking from the south, okay, to the main city and across the way to Galata or Pera, which I'll discuss in a minute. But you can see the Golden Horn again, and the Bosphorus is over here. So as Constantinople is being refounded as a late antique city, Christian structures, however, are being built at the same time, and Christianity is gaining. And certainly by the 5th century, it is not only the official religion of the state, but there's active persecution of those who are not Christian. And the greatest building project of this early period is, of course, Hagia Sophia, okay? The Church of the Holy Wisdom, okay? Which is a landmark in Istanbul today. It's still standing. It was built by Justinian in the 6th century, Justinian the lawgiver. And it was famous, among many other things, for its enormous dome. Okay, this church has also been damaged by fire and rebuilt, and we'll talk about its history under the Ottomans as well. You can see the minarets, which are now part of the church, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And this is the interior of the church, and you can see that Arabic writing has been placed at the front, Arabic writing talking about Allah and Muhammad. Okay, but the church is a museum today. And those minarets are the skyline of Hagia Sophia. Okay, I don't want to go to that yet. So this was only the greatest of what were many, many churches going up, what was slowly becoming the capital of the Eastern Christian world. And then Istanbul, beginning in the 7th century, went into its first dark age, and one of the amazing things, or maybe it's not amazing in a city whose history is this long, is that Istanbul has sort of died out and been reborn many, many times. And this is the first period of decay in the city. Not just in the city, the 7th and 8th centuries in the Byzantine Empire is a time about which we know very little. Lots of catastrophes, lots of natural catastrophes, lots of invasions. And the empire that emerges in the 9th century is really medieval Byzantium. Okay? It's no longer a late antique city. Paganism is over. It's a very Christian empire. But what sort of happened in those 2 centuries as the Byzantine Empire transitions from a late antique city, something we would recognize as Roman, to something Byzantine. We don't know too much about it, but we do know there was very, very little building that went on in the 7th and 8th century. All these building programs came to a halt. There was a gradual ruination of public buildings, and there was the abandonment of earlier urbanistic practices like the public baths. All the things associated with a Roman city went out of use. In 618, the grain supply from Egypt, okay, which was always vital to the city, was discontinued. And here we have to bear in mind what's going on in the larger empire. Okay? Which is that this entire southern coast, okay, which had been all one empire, the entire southern coast is lost to the empire forever to the conquering Muslim armies. Okay? And the 7th century is the century when the Muslims come out of Arabia, and in the fastest conquest in human history by the early 8th century are in southern Spain. Okay? And all of this, the entire southern holdings of the Byzantine Empire are gone by the middle of the 7th century. And this certainly explains part of the empire's troubles. Egypt had been the grain basket, and this was cut off. And it's amazing how there are these sort of built-in geographical connections in the Mediterranean that never go away, so that later on, when the Ottomans restored the unity of the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, the first thing they did was resume the grain shipments from Egypt. Okay, but these were cut off for Byzantium. The Arabs come out of the Muslims come out of the Arabian Peninsula early in the 7th century. They first besieged the city in 626, and they cut off its major source of water, which was restored only in 768. There was another siege in 674, lasted 5 years, another siege in 717, this time lasting 2 years. Okay. From this time forward, okay, Byzantium and the city of Constantinople will be on the front line, okay, of the battle between Christianity and Islam. Okay? And as we'll see later on, the city is actually conquered by Muslims, but not by Arab Muslims. The Arabs never manage it, okay? But of course they want to, because there was only one city in the world that mattered, and that was Constantinople. Okay? It was the gem of the medieval world, just as it had been of the late antique world, and everybody wanted it. By the end of this period, by the end of the 8th century, estimates are that there were only a few tens of thousands living among the ruins of past glories, down from a height of 400,000 in the 6th century. Only one public granary appeared to have survived. One harbor out of 4 continued to function for non-military purposes. The great public baths and the theaters were abandoned. The building shifts to imperial palaces, to churches, and to hospices for the poor. And this is when Byzantium really starts to look like a Christian city. The monuments that remained, and they did, okay, these statues, these columns, were no longer understood for what they were, and they assumed a kind of mythic character. They were invested with occult power, and the cryptic messages they conveyed, the philosophers said, could only be understood by the philosophers. There's kind of a quirky walking tour written sometime in the 8th century, one of the few sources from the 8th century, where one of these Byzantine philosophers sort of walks around and says, oh, what's this? You know, here's a statue. We're not really sure what it is, but we know stories were told about it, and evil power is coming from it. And there was a tremendous fear of these statues and what they might do to people. Okay? And we'll see that today, people in Istanbul also live amongst ruins that no longer mean anything to them or have lost their meaning. Okay? It's a city where people are always living with the layers of the past, and this happened as early as the 8th century when the physical remains of paganism were there and people weren't really sure what to make of them. The city begins to recover in the 9th century, and it particularly starts to recover in the part of the city that's called Beyoğlu or Pera. Okay, Pera is Greek, just means over there. And why was this? Okay. This is a tower. This is in Galata. You can see this is the Galata Bridge, which links sort of the old city of Istanbul to Pera. Okay, this tower was built by the Genoese in the 13th century. Okay. By the time Byzantium starts to recover in the 9th century, we're now entering the period of the Western Crusades. Okay? And we know the Crusaders made it to Jerusalem. Okay? But something that isn't as well known is that even when they lost Jerusalem, okay, even when Saladin, the Muslim conqueror, took back Jerusalem, okay, the Crusaders had essentially taken over the trade of the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay? The Italians mostly. Okay? And they set up shop here in Pera, okay? Which would be known from now on, from henceforth, as the European quarter. okay, as the place where infidels lived, as the place where there were wine shops, racy activities, loose women, so on and so forth. Galata took on this reputation. Okay, so foreign trading colonies took up residence beginning particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries. Okay? And remember that Constantinople is at the confluence of all these trading routes. Okay? So all the trade of Eurasia, okay, starting in China, would come all the way, all the spices, all the riches of the East that the Europeans wanted, okay, came across the Eurasian steppe, okay, to Constantinople, where they were picked up by not the Byzantines, okay, who have recovered but will never again have the commercial strength that they once had, where they are picked up by Italian merchants living in Pera, in Galata, okay, or living up in colonies on the Black Sea. These goods are picked up and then distributed to the rest of Europe. Okay. So there are Venetians there are people from Pisa, there are Genoese, so on and so forth. In the main city itself, okay, where the great Byzantine churches are, we see the establishment of great sort of urban abbeys, monasteries in name. They also served educational, welfare, and financial functions. The orphanage of St. Paul, one tourist remarked, was so large that a tour of it required an entire day. Okay. So this period between the 9th and the 12th centuries, known as the period of the Macedonian and the Komnenian dynasties, the two different dynasties that ruled the city at this time, constitute a period of great florescence and building activity. Benjamin of Tudela, the great traveler of the 12th century, said, "The Greek inhabitants are very rich in gold and precious stones, and they wear clothes and garments of silk with gold embroidery, and they ride horses and look like princes. Wealth like that in Constantinople is not to be found in the whole world." Okay. And this is something the Europeans always remarked on up until about the 17th century. Okay? Because at this time, coming from Europe, 11th, 12th century, Europe is a bunch of little villages. Okay? They had simply never seen anything like Constantinople. This is a church built during this period by the Macedonian, during the Macedonian Komnenian dynasties, called the Kyriotissa Church. It is now a mosque, okay, but it survives. And I'm sorry the quality isn't so good. I'm not an art historian. I don't have great pictures. But these are some of the mosaics, okay, that are inside the Kyriotissa Church and another church known as the Church of the Hora. Okay? And we can see these mosaics because today in Istanbul, there's active archaeological activity going on all the time. And not just, in fact, not even mainly for the Ottoman period, but particularly for the Byzantine period. Because even though these churches are in what's now a Muslim country, after Thessaloniki in northern Greece and maybe Ravenna in Italy, the best place to see Byzantine art and churches and frescoes and mosaics is Istanbul. Okay? And a lot of it is being restored. Okay. Then the next decline, which is the sack of 1204. That's the sack of 1204. This is the Fourth Crusade. And what I must put in now is the third part of this triangle. I've spoken about Christians and Muslims. I have to add the third piece, okay, which is sort of a constant in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the effects of it are still with us today, which is by 1204, the Christian world has drifted apart, okay, into what we consider the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. Okay. It's a gradual split. There's plenty of invective, and it's basically sort of people who no longer understand each other, people who no longer speak a common language. The Greeks use Greek. In the West, it's Latin, saying all sorts of things about each other. Well, the way they worship is strange, and they eat unleavened bread, and so on and so forth. But it's basically kind of a mistrust of the other until 1204, when the Crusaders, who are going back to try and get Jerusalem, which they don't, they decide to take a detour and to sack Constantinople instead. Okay, so it is sacked by Western Christians. This kind of seals the deal. From that point on, relations between East and West, Eastern and Western Christendom, were very bad. Okay? Even to the point today, the Pope's recent visit to Turkey, there was a lot of interest in whether or not the Pope would meet with the Turkish Prime Minister. Less noticed was that the Pope and the Orthodox Patriarch, whose see is still in Istanbul, barely exchanged words. Okay? And when these crusaders came, of course, they were astonished by Constantinople. During the Latin occupation, many buildings were damaged or fell into disrepair. Many of the Christian relics that had been brought to the city, that was a way of making the city a city Christian, just like the Venetians brought the head of St. Mark from Alexandria, or so they said it was the head of St. Mark, to Venice, which is why it became the city of St. Mark. So Constantinople had all sorts of relics. Those were lost, and the best things were carted home. So the so-called 4 horses of St. Mark's, if you ever go to Venice and see them on the front of the Church of St. Mark in the main piazza, those were looted from Constantinople. Okay, this Latin occupation, which is how Western Christians are known in the East, Latins or Franks, went from 1204 to 1260. The Byzantines managed to get it back, and they have another century or so of florescence, the Paleologian period, okay, the last great period of the Byzantine Empire, more churches being built, so on and so forth. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death hits, not just in Constantinople, but of course throughout Europe. And in the 60 years between 1340 and 1400, the population of Asia declined from Eurasia from 238 million to 201 million. The loss in Europe represented between a third to half of the total population. By comparison, in the tremendous destruction of World War II, France lost just 1.5% of its population. So by 1400, Constantinople is again in pretty bad shape. Okay? It's depopulated. It's shrunk to a collection of small towns separated by farms and orchards within the walls. The lead on the roof of the Imperial Palace has been used to mint coins. Okay? And who's coming along but the Turks? Okay? And this is why I put this up, because it's the Turks who are responsible for the famous skyline of Istanbul. The Turks are part of this wave of Central Asian nomads that have been coming out of Central Asia forever, but particularly once again, sort of with added force beginning in the 12th century. They're coming across slower and slower and slower, going across Anatolia. By 1400, they've basically got Constantinople surrounded. They've taken the Balkans, they've taken Anatolia, and all that's left is the capital city. Okay? And this time, the Muslims manage it. Not Arab Muslims, but Turkish Muslims managed to take the city in 1453. And the West-East sort of split comes into it as well, because the Greeks had a huge debate. The Western Christians said, we'll help you if you accept church union, if you basically accept the supremacy of the Pope. And half the people were saying, yes, we should, and the other half were saying no. And there was a famous comment, better the turban of the Turk than the hat of the Pope. In other words, would rather live under Muslims than under the Latins. So this is in 1453. It's the end of the Ottoman Empire. It's the end of the Byzantine Empire, the beginning of the Ottomans, and it turns from a Christian to a Muslim city. Okay? Mehmed the Conqueror is the Sultan who manages the feat. Okay? And he saw himself as the new Roman emperor. Okay? This might seem strange to us that a Muslim would think of himself as the Roman emperor, but this was the legacy, this was the mantle that one assumed when one got the imperial city. And he fancied himself a new Alexander the Great. In fact, he had a copy of Arrian's Life of Alexander in his library, and it was read to him daily. A Genoese said a few days after the fall of the city, in sum, he has become so insolent after the capture that he sees himself soon becoming master of the whole world, and swears publicly that before 2 years have passed, he intends to reach Rome. Okay? So these two Roman cities from antiquity are still sort of the measure of what accomplishment is. Istanbul, under the Ottomans, okay, undergoes a tremendous revitalization. Okay? Mehmed the Conqueror and other sultans bring in artists, builders. This is the interior of the mosque built by the conqueror, his mosque, and almost every sultan built a mosque, greater or smaller, and it's the mosques of 3 or 4 sultans that account for the skyline of Istanbul. He brought in Persian astronomers from Samarkand. He brought in Gentile Bellini, the Italian painter, to paint that famous portrait of him. Okay? And Istanbul in the 16th century really became one of the great cities of the Renaissance. But he also took care to make it a holy city of Islam. First, many churches were changed into mosques, and a sort of fictive relationship to the early Arab conquerors was also established. Fatih's mosque was meant to rival Hagia Sophia, okay, in its grandeur. Now, it might surprise you that Muslims come in and don't just sort of razz all the churches to the ground, okay? And certainly some were, okay, and many were converted to mosques by the addition of minarets, okay? But this was an imperial city, okay? And the imperial idea was that you were supposed to rule over the best, the most splendid things that the world had to offer. Okay? It's not the vision of ethnic purity as we have with nationalism, that you have to wipe out any trace of the previous people. You take it all over and make it your own, and that makes you a great emperor. Okay? So the sultans of Istanbul were proud, okay, to rule over these beautiful buildings. One big difference between the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine Empire was that under the sultans and all the way up until 1923, Constantinople was a multinational, multi-religious city, certainly the most cosmopolitan city in Europe. A census in 1477 found 9,500 Muslim households, 3,800 Greek households, 1,600 Jewish, 440 Armenian, and 300 European. And Constantinople has more names and more languages than any other city, I believe, in the world. For most of Ottoman history, Christians and Jews made up about 40% of the capital's population. There were a number of reasons for this. Ottoman pragmatism, they were famously pragmatic, and for the first 150 years of their empire, their population was largely Christian. They didn't get the sort of the heartland of Islam till later. Also, Islam, the religious dictates of Islam say that Christians and Jews are people of the book, and they suffer certain legal disabilities, they pay taxes, so on and so forth, but they're not to be killed or forced to convert. We hear of the presence also of Western Christians. In 1547, there were 67 churches operating in Istanbul. By 1640, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and others had a church in Galata. Again, the Europeans stay on that side of the water. Catholic street processions took place at Christmas, and on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, the Orthodox bishop always threw a cross onto the Bosphorus to bless the waters. And tombs were visited by all faiths. Fatih built himself a new palace, okay, right on the point sticking out into the Bosphorus. Okay, this is the Topkapı Palace, which you can visit. Quite plain on the exterior, as Islamic monuments tend to be. All of the luxury is inside. This is the entrance to the Topkapı. And there's also, it's very spacious inside. You can walk around, and there are all sorts of pavilions. And this is another building inside the Topkapı Palace. It went from 80,000 people in the 15th century to 400,000 in 1530. Okay? So once again, the city rose from the ashes, and in the 16th century, certainly enjoyed another golden age. Let me go now to the 19th century, okay? When another new building project begins in the city, which was the attempt to make the city modern. Okay? In the 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire, not just in terms of the city, but is the century where the Sultan, the advisors to the Sultan, and many people in the population say, you know, the West is getting ahead of us, we need to become more Western. Okay. After the Crimean War in mid-19th century, there was a commission for the regulation of the city. 7 of its 13 members were foreign, and it declared, quote, "In Istanbul, the state of buildings, lighting, and cleanliness of the city is second rate." Okay? We need to spruce things up. Most of this was done in Pera, in the European quarter, okay? And that is the center of the modern city. Okay, if you went to Istanbul today and were going to rent an apartment, it's highly unlikely that you would rent an apartment in the old part of the city. Okay, all of the banks and the hotels and foreign settlement and sort of more westernized Turks live in Galata, which is now, of course, spread further up. The streets were widened and street names were extended throughout the city. And Pera became self-consciously Parisian. It was known, particularly at this time, as the city of sin. There was a saying that even the good Lord is different in Pera. Opera performances were in Italian, but Friday matinees were in Ottoman Turkish. The Sultan moved out of the Topkapı, which was now seen as insufficiently Western. Sorry, I forgot to show that. That's another mosque that was built by Ahmed in the early 18th century. That's the Blue Mosque. And this is the Dolmabahce, which just means stuffed with gardens. This is the Dolmabahce Palace built along the Bosphorus, and the new building went along the water. Okay? And you can see it's much more ornate on the outside. It's a European palace. Okay? And this is what was going on throughout the 19th century. Crowds gathered at the Bosphorus to watch the arrival of the first steamship in 1828, and steam service became regular, and the journey from Marseille in France was shortened from 6 weeks to 6 days. Okay. I think Istanbul has a reputation as a city of intrigue, and there are many phases where you could say you can understand why it got this reputation, but I think it's particularly the 19th century. Okay? I'd mentioned that 7 out of the 13 members of this committee to beautify the city were foreign. What are all these foreigners doing in the Ottoman Empire? Europeans. Istanbul, the 19th century, is certainly undergoing a new golden age, okay, for those who can afford it, this wonderful cosmopolitan city. But 2 clouds are looming over the city. One is the Eastern question, and the second is nationalism. The Eastern question is basically, by the 19th century, the only reason the Ottoman Empire is still around, because it's been defeated numerous times now militarily by Europe, is that the Europeans can't decide who should get it. Okay, and this was the so-called Eastern question, which lasted from the end of the 18th century until 1923. And the main protagonists were the English, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians. Okay? But everybody's there. And so Istanbul is swarming with diplomats and schemes and plans. Okay? It's kind of like a game of red light, green light. Okay? There's some sort of uprising, there's a war, a little piece of the empire is lost, and everyone rushes to make their claims, and then there's a diplomatic conference, and the brakes are put on it. But everyone stays in place because the next time things break down, you want to make sure that you are in the game. And the main protagonists in this are the British and the Russians. That's one thing, the Eastern question. Okay? And it's the reason why Europeans are swarming all over Istanbul. The other is nationalism. Okay? This is a multinational empire. It's not a Turkish empire. It's often called that. That's a mistake. The Sultan didn't represent Turks or Muslims. He was the Sultan. He didn't represent anybody. Okay? But nationalism was on the rise. For every nation, a state. Okay? By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottomans have already lost a lot of their European provinces. Do I have a map of that? No, I don't. These are just some shots of the Galata Bridge, which was built during this 19th century modernization. Here's a more romantic image of it, and this is what it is today. You can see a lot of advertisement. They're selling fish sandwiches. There are a lot of restaurants along the Galata Bridge. The empire has lost a lot of its European provinces to newly founded nation states, the Greek state, the Bulgarian state. Okay? Now, of course, there are Greeks and Bulgarians still within the empire's population. There are Arabs, there are Turks. Okay? Are they going to want their own nation? Okay? So these are the two clouds hanging over, over the city. And its fate is finally decided by World War I, okay, which is typical. I mean, it's a time when the alliances, when the agreement amongst the Europeans to agree was in place, then there was a stop. Okay? But whenever the European alliance fell apart, then all bets were off and everyone was racing for Istanbul. In St. Petersburg in November of 1914, Tsar Nicholas issued a manifesto calling for the fulfillment of Russia's mission on the shores of the Bosphorus. Okay? Russia was now the preeminent Eastern Orthodox Christian power, and it said, we should have Constantinople. This was a long-standing dream of the Russian czars. It's hard to know what would have happened if the Russian Revolution hadn't broken out. But it did, and the Bolsheviks were not interested in Eastern Orthodox dreams of taking over Constantinople. Anyway, the fateful decision that the Ottomans made, and there's a lot of debate about why they did this, was they came in on the wrong side. They came in on the German side. So they were one of the defeated at the end of World War I. On the 13th and 14th of November 1918, British and French forces landed from Allied ships, and they occupied the city. And this is a picture of a British soldier in Istanbul during this period between 1918 and 1923. Okay. This was a national humiliation. It certainly contributed to the development of Turkish nationalism. Okay. There's a saying that everybody in the end rejected the Ottoman Empire, even the Turks. Okay. The British had promised the Ottoman representative that Constantinople would not be occupied, and when the Ottomans protested, the British representative calmly replied that Constantinople had been chosen as British headquarters, and the Ottoman official was too taken aback to reply. In February 1919, in a vengeful echo of the entrance of Fatih the Conqueror in 1453, the commander of the French forces rode to the French embassy on a white horse, presented by a Greek. The main street was lined with Allied troops and cheering Greeks and Armenians. Okay? In other words, they really rubbed their faces in it. Okay? At this point, it looked like the city might actually go to the Greeks. And this is the Ottoman Sultan in 1920 signing what is considered sort of the blackest day in Ottoman and Turkish history, signing the Treaty of Sèvres, okay, which imposed essentially partition on the Ottoman Empire. They lost all the Arab provinces. The Greeks were going to get something. The Armenians were going to get something. In the end, the international community decided that they would keep Istanbul, but all of the waterways around it were internationalized. Okay. Turkey is the only country, defeated country out of World War I that upset, through force of arms, the treaty that had been imposed upon it. Okay. As this is going on, and as the Sultan, okay, is being humiliated by the Allied forces, okay, and the Allies aren't really sure what they want to do, but they know they like the Sultan pliable. But of course, the more the Sultan was the puppet of the Allies, the more discredited he was in the eyes of the Turkish Muslims. While this is going on, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is out in the middle of Anatolia, and he's organizing an army. And what basically happens, I don't want to take up too much more time, is that he comes out of Anatolia all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean and defeats the Greek settlement, defeats the Greek army that is there, essentially throws them into the sea, at which point the Europeans, the British and the French say, oh, we didn't expect any resistance. This is going to be trouble, and they basically sign a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, which establishes the borders of contemporary Turkey. Okay? And then he put an end to this corrupt, as he put it, decaying pawn of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. One of the most international cities in the world became one of the most nationalist. As of 1926, the post office would only accept letters where Istanbul was written, no other form of the city's name. But this is a time when most international cities, under the force of nationalism, became homogenized. Vienna became provincial, Prague became wholly Czech, Trieste Italian, and so too Istanbul. It held out a bit longer. Until 1940, until 1950, there were still 100,000 Greeks in the city. Today, there are about 2,000, and most of them are over 65. You might have heard of Orhan Pamuk, who has written, who just won the Nobel Prize in Literature, who's written a beautiful book about Istanbul, and he finds it a very melancholy city. And I'll just quote to you a few things that he says about the city today. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the world almost forgot that Istanbul existed. The city into which I was born was poorer, shabbier, and more isolated than it had ever been before in its 2,000-year history. For me, it has always been a city of ruins and of end of empire melancholy. Thank you. I guess you can ask questions now, if you have any. Yes.
It's your favorite city.
Yes.
What in particular makes it better?
Oh, just a minute. Sorry. These are two very, very different shots. This is from Orhan Pamuk's book. Okay, these are very different. This is the Galata Bridge, and this is what has remained of the Ottoman city. Okay, most of it has been bulldozed, and the old Ottoman buildings, the wooden buildings, are in a state of disrepair. Well, I'm an Ottoman historian, and it's packed, through and through with Ottoman history. So I love that. It's beautiful. Like many other people, I've just been seduced by its beauty, sitting up there high above the Bosphorus, looking over to Asia and the ships going back and forth. And finally, I am an historian of commerce. I like to think of things moving around and where stuff is going. And you get this feeling that you're sitting at a crossroads. Okay, down there is the Mediterranean in the south, up there is Russia, and everything's coming through. So I guess those are the... Plus, I think Turkish food is the best food in the world. Even better than Greek food, although they wouldn't like it if I said that. Very similar, but the Turks, a little bit better. Yes?
Can you quickly give a summary of what the problem with the Armenians was?
I've hinted at it a bit. Okay, the Ottoman Empire is under tremendous pressure. Okay, due to nationalism. Okay, and are its subject peoples going to rise up and demand their own state? Okay, by the time World War I comes along, the Ottoman Empire is very, very suspicious of its Christian population. Okay, the Bulgarians have established their own state. The Greeks have established their own state. The Serbians. Okay, and they suspect the Armenians of wanting to do the same thing. Okay. And some Armenians do, and some Armenians don't. I mean, there's always debate about these things. The Armenians are physically located, the vast majority of the Armenians are not in Istanbul. They're on the eastern border, okay, with what is Russia, okay? And during World War I, okay, the Russians are coming along, and the Ottomans are afraid that the Armenians are a fifth column and are going to break off yet another piece of the empire by cooperating with the Russians, and the Russians will give it to them out of a sort of pan-Christian sympathy. In the context of that, Ottoman generals give the order to basically adopt a scorched earth policy to move the Armenian population out of eastern Anatolia. This is in 1915. I mean, in the middle of this pressure cooker, which is World War I, where the Ottomans are fighting not just this world war, but this war with their own subject populations. Now, what exactly happened then, and more importantly, who wanted what to happen? Did they want to wipe out the Armenian nation? I mean, that's a tremendous controversy. But that's the context for what happened in eastern Anatolia. Yes?
Do you know today the reaction of the average Turkish or Istanbul resident in the application for the how do they feel about that?
Yeah, there's a tremendous divide. And there's a tremendous divide in Istanbul today between the city proper, as it were. The city is now, let me see, I think I had it. The city, by the end of the 1950s, it had about 1 million people. By 2000, it had 10 million. Okay? It's become one of these third world sprawling cities surrounded by slums. Okay? And you often hear the comment that people in the slums have never even seen the Bosphorus. These are people mostly from eastern Anatolia, from the southeastern area near the border with Syria. And those people live in a completely different world than the more westernized residents of Istanbul proper. The more westernized residents are foreign, by and large. The people in the slums, not so much. And there is certainly resistance. I'm sure you've heard that just a few weeks ago there was a great tragedy in the Armenian editor of an Armenian newspaper who's been an outspoken proponent of speaking about what happened to the Armenians in 1915 with Turkish support. For the first time last year or the year before, Turkish academics, friends of mine, managed to hold a conference in Turkey, a scholarly conference, to discuss what happened in 1915. So all of these people are very favorable towards the EU. But there is this feeling that this, so anyway, he was assassinated a few weeks ago. He was murdered in the streets in Istanbul. And there is suspicion that not so much Islamists, but extreme nationalists within the Turkish government who don't want to surrender the amount of sovereignty that the Europeans require, there's a sense that they are doing everything they can to make trouble, to say, look, in fact, we are, a barbarous, terrible nation that the Europeans wouldn't want. We do stifle writers and so on and so forth. Because, of course, the Europeans aren't crazy about letting Turkey in either. So it's murky right now. Yes?
What's the origin of the conflict between Turkey and Kurds?
This is another one of these cases of in the course of World War I, or even beforehand. I mean, from 1830, let's say, when the Greeks managed to establish their own state, they set the model. I mean, it took a long, long time. People have been part of an imperial system for hundreds and hundreds of years. The idea of not having an emperor or sultan, but instead having your own state was strange for many, many people. But basically that model had been set. So from that point on, the various groups in the empire and how they defined themselves was, of course, a tremendous struggle. Some were thinking, hey, we'd like our own state. And it was really in the great power politics of World War I and its aftermath, which also set up the modern Middle East. I mean, it's just tremendous. I mean, these 2 years between 1918 and 1920 are just incredible for what they did in terms of reordering this part of the world. Some groups had gotten an early start, like the Greeks. Some groups, like the Greeks, had sympathy in Europe. Okay, when the Greeks rose up, the Europeans thought this was terrific. When the Serbians rose up, it was like, who are the Serbs? I mean, nobody knew who they were. People knew about the Greeks from the classical period. And so some people got a state and some people did not. Okay? There was a Kurdish leadership that wanted a state. They did not have an international backer. Ataturk came along with this tremendously successful military campaign, and the Kurds lost out. Now, I want to say the Kurds lost out now that Turkey, like every other part of the world, was going to be ruled by the dictates of nationalism. Okay? Abdul Hamid, the last real Ottoman Sultan, was not just being a figurehead, reigned from 1878 to 1908. His palace bureaucracy had Albanians, had Kurds. One of the most famous Turkish nationalists of the 19th century was a Kurd. Okay? He had Arabs. He had Albanians. Okay? The Ottoman Empire didn't work according to the national principles, so the Kurds were not defined as an enemy. The Kurds were Muslim. Okay? And in fact, the categories of the empire were religious. You were either Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. You weren't Greek or Serbian or Bulgarian or Arab or Kurd. But nationalism is a very suspicious ideology, and in the context of Turkish nationalism, particularly with this history of various, of subject peoples breaking off bits of the empire, the Turks became very suspicious and in fact created a Kurdish enemy. I mean, the Ottoman Sultan would never have thought of saying to someone, you can't speak your national language. I mean, what did he care? There are 15 million different languages spoken in Istanbul. But Ataturk comes to power and suddenly you can't speak Kurdish. But that is the logic of nationalism, not just in Turkey, but throughout the world. Yes?
Turkey became a full member of NATO, I believe, in the early years of the Cold War.
Yes.
From a historian standpoint, can you tell us what were the politics of that? How did that occur?
Yeah, I would say that, where Europe ends in the East has always been a political question, right? In the South, there's the Mediterranean. The West, there's the Atlantic. I mean, that's it. But, where is that line between us and them, however they're defined, in the East? And it's always been uncertain. I mean, we talk about European and Asiatic Russia, but the only thing dividing them is the Urals, which you can walk over. I mean, it's kind of an arbitrary point. At the end of World War II, Turkey, who had been neutral during World War II, but at the end of World War II, Turkey and Greece are on the front line. They're on the front line of communism. Okay? And the U.S. Particularly wants to make absolutely sure that those two states, which are sort of floating out there and could be taken over by the communists, and there was actually a civil war in Greece because the communists were so strong. That wasn't the case in Turkey. So the U.S. makes Turkey a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Obviously, Turkey is nowhere near the North Atlantic, and neither is Greece. Okay, to make sure. Okay, that was the dividing line of the Cold War. Okay, the Turkish-Russian border and the Greek-Yugoslav border. So that was the incentive for, or not the incentive. That was the imperative. That was the Truman Doctrine. We're going to bring Greece and Turkey into NATO to make sure that they are part of the quote-unquote free world. And actually, the Greeks are kind of miffed because with the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, Greece is no longer so strategic because now north of Greece is just mass. I mean, there's no more Iron Curtain there. It's not this big. It's not this big sort of chasm of the Cold War years. But Turkey continues to be strategic, right? Because now instead of fending off all those terrible communists, you'll hear over and over, the only democracy in the Middle East, the only Muslim democracy in the Middle East. Turkey is seen as a bulwark by the Americans against the Islamic world. Turkey, which has always feared Russia and then the Soviet Union, I mean, this rivalry, okay, this antagonism has been going on since the 18th century, and it lasted through the communist period, and it's still there today. So the Turks have always been very, very happy to have the American umbrella over them. The invasion of Iraq, however, has been disastrous for the American reputation in Turkey. And I think when they do polls now, sort of the favorable attitude of Americans has gone from 80% to 12%. And of course, down in the south, they're not pleased to see an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Yes?
Back to the Armenians for a moment. Were they or were they not massacred? If I speak to Armenians, they were. If I speak to Turks, it never happened. As a matter of fact, I think they even arrested this Nobel Prize winner.
Right, Elie Shafak, and then released her. I mean, this is why they think that, people are sort of working behind the scenes to try and make Turkey as terrible a candidate as possible for the EU. There was a massacre, absolutely, and there are many Turkish scholars today, younger generation, who will say that, Orhan Pamuk being one of them. Was there a genocide? And I'm not going to say yes or no. Was there an Ottoman attempt to wipe out the Armenian nation? I don't think anybody knows that.
But am I correct in that there were almost 1 million Armenians were massacred?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the numbers are huge. Absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. Yes?
Is there a growing movement of fundamentalist Islam?
Growing, I don't know. I mean, the leadership of the prime minister is from the Welfare Party, which is the Islamic Party. The Islamic Party, so the Islamists, you could say, are in power in Turkey. And they seem to have basically taken over the social welfare rhetoric of the left from the 1970s. And this seems to be the extent of it. I mean, there's certainly nothing about, bringing in Islamic law. There is more veiling, but you don't see too much of that in Istanbul. Preventing that is, of course, the military establishment, which is still Kemalist, people call it, in other words, loyal to Ataturk, who wanted to basically wipe Islam off the face of Turkey. So the military will only let this go so far, but of course the military themselves have been pretty tough cookies. And this is the problem for liberals and for Democrats in Turkey and throughout the Middle East, is they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either have these brutal military elites or you have the Islamists. Yes?
Can you comment a little bit on the Jewish community that existed in Istanbul and how that evolved?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. There was just so much to talk about. It's good you bring up the Jews. I want to emphasize that this is a very troubled part of the world today, but I try and convey to my students that until about the early 19th century, this was a very quiet part of the world. Okay, a city like Jerusalem, which is always presented as centuries of warring, Jerusalem was a provincial, sleepy little village until about 1917, 1918. Really World War I. Okay? And the historic enmity in the world has been between Muslims and Western Christians, not between Muslims and Jews. So the story of the Jews is very interesting. There was a small Jewish community continued in the Byzantine Empire under persecution, under threat. Okay, the Byzantines imposed a Christian empire in the way that the Ottomans did not for Islam. Arabic-speaking in the Arab provinces, Greek-speaking basically in the Balkans. Okay, but they were small. There is the persecution and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. Okay, and this is very, very consequential for Jewish history in Istanbul, in the Ottoman Empire. They leave the Iberian Peninsula, both Spain and then later on Portugal. They kind of hopscotch across the Mediterranean. They're in Ferrara for a while. They get expelled. They're in Venice. They get expelled. And the Ottoman Sultan, who, remember, is this Sultan. He's an emperor, and the whole imperial idea is to take the best and sort of get everybody in under your rule. It's the opposite of the national idea. Okay? So the Ottoman Sultan said, come to Turkey, come to the Ottoman Empire. So the Sephardim, the Jews from Spain, okay, went to Istanbul, became very, very prominent in the 16th century as bankers, as financiers, as industrialists. They brought languages, knowledge of the West, Western technology. So the Sephardic community came in and pretty much dominated the local Romaniot, as they were called, the Greek-speaking, and to a certain extent even the Arabic-speaking population. So really the history of Jews in the Ottoman Empire is the history of the Sephardim, because this is where they found refuge. The Ottoman sultans had policies of settling people that had urban skills in various cities. They liked to repopulate cities. And when the Sephardim came in the early 16th century, he put almost all of them in Thessaloniki, which is today the capital of northern Greece. And all these cities that are so homogeneous today, until very, very recently, were incredibly multi-ethnic. Thessaloniki was an Ottoman city from the 14th century until 1912. Thessaloniki was known as the New Jerusalem because so many Jews lived there. The Jews were loyal Ottomanists to the end, naturally. They didn't have their own nation. They didn't look with favor, as you can imagine, on Balkan nationalism. Okay? And some Jews went on and became citizens of Turkey. Again, it's not as congenial an atmosphere as it was under the Ottomans. And some emigrated to Israel and elsewhere. So the community is not as strong as it used to be. But that's sort of, in a nutshell, the history of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire. Yes?
Who exactly are the Turks? Anatolia must have been fairly sparsely populated. Are they part of the Turkmen tribes in Iran? Are they part of the people from
They originate in the Central Asian steppe. And yes, it's a mixed up group. I mean, what are the differences between Turks and Mongols and so on and so forth? Okay? They're identified as Turks because they speak a Turkic language. There are a number of Turkish languages. I think it's called Chaga. Anyway, it's the Western Turkish language. Okay? At various times, going way, way back, these Central Asian peoples streamed out of Central Asia due to population pressure or the opportunity to raid commerce and so on and so forth. Some went east, some went west, which I guess my Turkish professor explained to me is one of the reasons why there's a strong grammatical similarity between Korean and Turkish. Okay, because one went east and one went west. There are Turkic groups, in other words, Turkish-speaking nomads, okay, who managed to break the Byzantine defenses in eastern Anatolia in the 12th century. They're coming along across Anatolia for a long time before they finally get to Istanbul. The Battle of Mens occurred at the end of the 12th century. As they go across Anatolia very, very slowly, Anatolia converts to Islam. And it takes about 400 years, and there are still pockets, but many of the Greek-speaking Christians of Anatolia became Muslim. Some of them never became Turkish-speaking. You have all sorts of combinations in the Ottoman Empire.
But I'm curious about the language. It's a very unusual language, Turkish. And where is the Greek?
It's considered an Altaic language. And I don't know more like what to say beyond that. I mean, from the area around the Altai Mountains. So whatever other languages belong to that Altaic group, the Ottoman sultans did not consider themselves Turkish. They did not consider them. I mean, they didn't say we're not Turkish, but the Ottomans considered themselves the followers of Osman, which is the name of the founder of the dynasty, okay, the one who first started winning battles. And Ottoman is just the Western sort of translation. I mean, that's how they rendered Osman. So they wanted to identify themselves, of course, with this winning dynasty. And ethnic terms generally were not how people viewed the world in the Ottoman Empire. That's why Christians in Aleppo and Christians in Belgrade were just Christians. They weren't Arabs and Serbs. Okay? So the whole idea of it being a Turk was muted because all ethnic categories were muted. And although ethnic categories were muted, they did have their reputations, and the Turks were considered rude and boorish. You wouldn't call someone a Turk until about 1900. That was like calling someone a redneck. Okay? And nobody wanted to be called a Turk. Okay? But what Ataturk did, and this is why I say in the end everyone rejected the Ottoman Empire, including the Turks, was to say, I'm a Turk and that's a good thing. And he founded, a Turkish nation, which the Ottomans never were. They were a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious imperial dynasty. Yes?
What are the legal rights of women in Turkey as compared with other Islamic countries?
Today?
When did it change?
Yeah, this is all stuff that the Ataturk really undertook a radical remaking of Turkey in the 1920s. And the reason I think it's fair to say that he could do this, really just sort of wipe out the Islamic roots of society, was that he was a national hero. He had defeated the Greeks. So he had tremendous charisma. I mean, and this allowed him to get rid of the Sultan, who had been around since the 14th century, and to end the role of the Islamic Caliphate. I mean, it's extraordinary what he did, and he was only able to do it because he defeated not just the British and the French, but more importantly, the Greeks. So he got rid of the Sharia, as the Islamic law is known, and he imported wholesale the Swiss Code, which is what Turkey still has today. It's secular. Now, there's the law and there's the reality, but if you want to know the legal situation, there is no Islamic law in Turkey.
Thank you very much.